The British National Antarctic Expedition 1901–04, generally known as the Discovery Expedition, was the first official British exploration of the Antarctic region since James Clark Ross's voyage 60 years earlier, organised on a large scale under a joint committee of the Royal Society and the Royal Geographical Society. The new expedition aimed to carry out scientific research and geographical exploration in what was then largely an untouched continent. It launched the Antarctic careers of many who would become leading figures in the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, including Robert Falcon Scott, who led the expedition, Ernest Shackleton, Edward Wilson, Frank Wild, Tom Crean and William Lashly. Its scientific results covered extensive ground in biology, zoology, geology, meteorology and magnetism. The expedition discovered the existence of the only snow-free Antarctic valleys, which contain Antarctica's longest river. Further achievements included the discoveries of the Cape Crozier Emperor Penguin Colony, King Edward VII Land, and the polar plateau on which the South Pole is located. The expedition did not make a serious attempt on the South Pole itself, with the principal southern journey traveling only as far as the farthest south marked a reported 82 degrees 17 S. As a trailbreaker for later ventures, the Discovery Expedition was a landmark in British Antarctic exploration history. After its return home, it was celebrated as a success, despite having needed an expensive relief mission to free Discovery and its crew from the ice, and later disputes about the quality of some of its scientific records. It has been asserted that the expedition's main failure was its inability to master the techniques of efficient polar travel using skis and dogs, a legacy that persisted in British Antarctic expeditions throughout the heroic age. Background to the expedition. Forerunners. Between 1839 and 1843, Royal Naval Captain James Clark Ross, commanding his two ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, completed 3 voyages to the Antarctic continent. During this time he discovered and explored a new sector of the Antarctic that would provide the field of work for many later British expeditions. Ross established the general geography of this region, and named many of its features: the Ross Sea, the Great Ice Barrier, Ross Island, Cape Adare, Victoria Land, McMurdo Sound, Cape Crozier, and the twin volcanoes Mount Erebus and Mount Terror. He returned to the barrier several times, hoping to penetrate it, but was unable to do so, achieving his farthest south in a small barrier inlet at 78 degrees 10 in February 1842. Ross suspected that land lay to the east of the barrier, but was unable to confirm this. After Ross, there were no recorded voyages into this sector of the Antarctic for 50 years. Then, in January 1895, a Norwegian whaling trip made a brief landing at Cape Adare, the northernmost tip of Victoria Land. 4 years later, Carsten Borchgrevink, who had participated in that landing, took his own expedition to the region in the Southern Cross. This expedition was financed by a donation of £35,000 from British publishing magnate Sir George Newnes, on condition that the venture be called the British Antarctic Expedition. Borchgrevink landed at Cape Adare in February 1899, erected a small hut, and spent the 1899 winter there. The following summer he sailed south, landing at Ross's Inlet on the barrier. A party of 3 then sledged southward on the barrier surface, and reached a new furthest south at 78 degrees 50. The Discovery Expedition was planned during a surge of international interest in the Antarctic Antarctic regions at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. A German expedition under Erich von Drygalski was leaving at about the same time as Discovery, to explore the sector of the continent south of the Indian Ocean. The Swedish explorer Otto Nordenskjöld was leading an expedition to Graham Land, and a French expedition under Jean-Baptiste Charcot was going to the Antarctic Peninsula. Finally, the Scottish scientist William Speirs Bruce was leading a scientific expedition to the Weddell Sea. Royal Navy, Markham and Scott, under the influence of John Barrow, second secretary to the Admiralty. Polar exploration had become the province of the peacetime Royal Navy after the Napoleonic War. Naval interest diminished after the disappearance in 1845 of the Franklin expedition and the many fruitless searches that followed. After the problems encountered by the 1874–76 North Pole expedition led by George Nares, and Nares's own declaration that the North Pole was impracticable, the Admiralty decided that further polar quests would be dangerous, expensive and futile. However, the Royal Geographical Society's secretary Sir Clemens Markham was a former naval man who had served on one of the Franklin relief expeditions in 1851. He had accompanied Nares for part of the 1874–76 expedition, and remained a firm advocate for the Navy's resuming its historic role in polar exploration. An opportunity to further this ambition arose in November 1893, when the prominent biologist Sir John Murray, who had visited Antarctic waters as a biologist with the Challenger expedition in the 1870s, addressed the RGS. Murray presented a paper entitled The Renewal of Antarctic Exploration and called for a full-scale expedition for the benefit of British science. This was strongly supported both by Markham and by the country's premier scientific body, the Royal Society. A joint committee of the two societies was established to decide the form which the expedition should take. Markham's vision of a full-blown naval affair after the style of Ross Franklin was opposed by sections of the Joint Committee, but his tenacity was such that the expedition was eventually molded largely to his wishes. His cousin and biographer later wrote that the expedition was the creation of his brain, the product of his persistent energy. It had long been Markham's practice to take note of promising young naval officers who might later be suitable for polar responsibilities, should the opportunity arise. He had first observed midshipman Robert Falcon Scott in 1887, while the latter was serving with HMS Rover in St Kitts, and had remembered him. 13 years later, Scott, by now a torpedo lieutenant on HMS Majestic, was looking for a path to career advancement, and a chance meeting with Sir Clements in London led him to apply for the leadership of the expedition. Scott had long been in Markham's mind, though by no means always his first choice, but other favoured candidates had either become in his view too old, or were no longer available. With Markham's determined backing, Scott's appointment was secured by the 25th of May 1900, followed swiftly by his promotion to commander. Science versus adventure. The command structure of the expedition had still to be settled. Markham had been determined from the beginning that its overall leader should be a naval officer, not a scientist. Scott, writing to Markham after his appointment, reiterated that he must have complete command of the ship and landing parties, and insisted on being consulted over all future appointments. However, the Joint Committee had, with Markham's acquiescence, secured the appointment of John Walter Gregory, Professor of Geology at the University of Melbourne and former Assistant Geologist at the British Museum, as the expedition's scientific director. Gregory's view, endorsed by the Royal Society faction of the Joint Committee, was that the organisation and command of the land party should be in his hands. The captain would be instructed to give such assistance as required in dredging, tow netting, etc., to place boats where required at the disposal of the scientific staff. In the dispute that followed, Markham argued that Scott's command of the whole expedition must be total and unambiguous, and Scott himself was insistent on this to the point of resignation. Markham's and Scott's view prevailed, and Gregory resigned, saying that the scientific work should not be subordinated to naval adventure. This controversy soured relations between the societies, which lingered after the conclusion of the expedition and was reflected in criticism of the extent and quality of some of the published results. Markham claimed that his insistence on a naval command was primarily a matter of tradition and style, rather than indicating disrespect for science. He had made clear his belief that, on its own, the mere attainment of higher latitude than someone else was unworthy of support. Personnel. Markham had hoped for a fully fledged Royal Naval Expedition, but was warned by the Admiralty that the present exigencies of the Naval Service prevent them from lending officers. However, the Admiralty agreed to release Scott and Charles Rhodes, and later allowed Michael Barne and Reginald Skelton to join the expedition. The remaining officers were from the Merchant Marine, including Albert Armitage, the second in command, who had experience with the Jackson-Harmsworth Arctic Expedition, 1894–97, and Ernest Shackleton, designated third officer in charge of holds, stores and provisions, and responsible for arranging the entertainments. The Admiralty also released around 20 petty officers and seamen, the rest of the crew being from the merchant service, or from civilian employment. Among the lower deck complement were some who became Antarctic veterans, including Frank Wild, William Lashly, Thomas Crean, Edgar Evans and Ernest Joyce. Although the expedition was not a formal Navy project, Scott proposed to run the expedition on naval lines, and secured the crew's voluntary agreement to work under the Naval Discipline Act. The scientific team was inexperienced. Dr. George Murray, Gregory's successor as chief scientist, was due to travel only as far as Australia, using the voyage to train the scientists, but with no part to play in the detailed work of the expedition. The only scientist with previous Antarctic experience was Louis Bernicke, who had been with Borchgrevink as magnetic observer and meteorologist. The geologist, Hartley Ferrier, was a 22-year-old recent Cambridge graduate who Markham thought might be made into a man. Marine biologist Thomas Vere Hodgson, from Plymouth Museum, was a more mature figure, as was the senior of the two doctors, Reginald Coatlets, who, at 39, was the oldest member of the expedition. He, like Armitage, had been with the Jackson-Harmsworth expedition. The junior doctor and zoologist was Edward Wilson, who became close to Scott and provided the qualities of calmness, patience and detachment that the captain reportedly lacked. Organization and objectives. Finance. The total cost of the expedition was estimated at £90,000, of which £45,000 was offered by the British government, provided that the two societies could raise a matching sum. They achieved this, thanks largely to a donation of £25,000 from wealthy RGS member Llewellyn W. Longstaff. The RGS itself contributed £8,000, its largest single contribution to any expedition to that date, and £5,000 came from Alfred Harmsworth, later Lord Northcliffe, who had earlier financed the Jackson-Harmsworth expedition to the Arctic, 1894–97. The rest was raised from smaller donations. The expedition also benefited from significant commercial sponsorship. Coleman's provided mustard and flour. Cadbury's gave £3,500 of chocolate. Birds donated baking and custard powders. Evans, Lesher and Amp Webb provided all the lime juice. Jaeger gave a 40% discount on special clothing. Bovril supplied beef extract, and others made significant contributions. The expedition's ship was built by the Dundee Shipbuilders Company as a specialist research vessel designed for work in Antarctic waters, and was one of the last three-masted wooden sailing ships built in Britain. The construction cost was £34,050, plus £10,322 for the engines, and the final cost after all modifications was £51,000. The name had historic naval associations, most recently as one of the ships used in the Nares expedition, and certain features of this older vessel were incorporated into the design of the new ship. She was launched by Lady Markham on 21 March 1901 as S.Y. Discovery. As she was not a Royal Naval vessel, the Admiralty would not allow Discovery to fly the White Ensign. She eventually sailed under the Merchant Shipping Act, flying the RGS House flag and the Blue Ensign and Burgee of the Royal Harwich Yacht Club. Dogs. Scott contacted Fridtjof Nansen in Oslo, whom he trusted more than his own quarrelling committee in London, and followed his advice on equipment. Subsequently, Armitage ordered 25 Siberian sledge dogs. Vera Scott's dog and ski expert based in Archangel, Russia. According to Huntford, however, this expert was not invited to join the expedition. Objectives. The Discovery expedition, like those of Ross and Borchgrevink before it, was to work in the Ross Sea sector of Antarctica. Other areas of the continent had been considered, but the principle followed was that, in going for the unknown, they should start from the known. The two main objectives of the expedition were summarized in the Joint Committee's instructions to the commander as to determine, as far as possible, the nature, condition and extent of that portion of the South Polar lands which is included in the scope of your expedition, and to make a magnetic survey in the southern regions to the south of the 40th parallel, and to carry out meteorological, oceanographic, geological, biological and physical investigations and researches. The instructions stipulated that neither of these objectives was to be sacrificed to the other. The instructions concerning the geographical objective became more specific. The chief points of geographical interest are to explore the ice barrier of Sir James Ross to its eastern extremity, to discover the land which was believed by Ross to flank the barrier to the eastward, or to ascertain that it does not exist if you should decide to winter in the ice. Your efforts as regards geographical exploration should be directed to an advance to the western mountains, an advance to the south, and an exploration of the volcanic region.